This is called an ingoni. Ingoni. It's made from a giant gourd, believe it or not. This is a fruit. It is a giant gourd with a very thick rind, and it dries. And when they dry it out, they're able to make different things out of it. Sometimes you could put rice or even water. It's covered in goat skin, and is the instrument of a griot. Now this is the educational part. Now listen to this. You may know this already, but I learned it, so I want to pass it on to you. A griot, it's a French word, G-R-I-O-T. It's much more than a storyteller. A griot is a keeper of the culture. They know everything there is about their community. They know when people were born, when they died, when they got married. They know the history. They know the religion. They know the music. They know everything. And it's all up here. This is their library. It's passed down orally from generation to generation. And this may be the instrument this is one of the instruments of a griot. And this particular one is a hunter's ingoni. And so I'm going to share this first story using this. So I need you to come with me, if you will. Imagine the sun is setting and melting into the horizon. And as the sun is setting, the people have gathered after a long day. A fire is blazing, leaping high. As everyone is seated around it, an elder comes in and begins to tell stories of far away and long ago. And help me start this story like this. I'm going to say, not in my time and not in your time. And I need you to say, but in the old time, when the earth and sea were new. So let's try just your part. But in the old time, when the earth and sea were new. Let's put it all together. Not in my time and not in your time.
But in the old time, when the earth and sea were new.
There was a village in Liberia, in the rainforest overlooking the Kavali River. And in that village, the village of Kundi, there was a great hunter. He went by the name of Ogalusa, the greatest hunter that there had ever been in that village. He would always go and come back, large, fierce, exotic animals. The children would gather around and they would sing his name. The men would admire the animals that he brought back. But Ogalusa would not rejoice in the songs of the children, nor in the praises of the men, but he would rejoice in his own children. He had 7 of them, all boys. Sorry, girls. And his wife was pregnant with an 8th child. And from the time that they were very young, the elders of that village spoke a word over them, that when those boys grew up, that they see that they would each have a gift. And when it was time, they must share that gift without reservation and without hesitation. And so although Ogalusa's wife did not know what these gifts would be, they treasured that in their heart, knowing that their children somehow would be special. Give something good back to this world. Well, one morning before the sun rose, Ogalusa went on one of his hunting expeditions, and he went to a hunting ground that no one had ever been to before. He went in a direction that no one didn't even know which way he left. So I tell you this, that evening at dinner, everyone was around the dinner table, but there was only one thing that was missing. Anyone have an idea what that one thing may have been? Ah, that is a good guess. But they did manage to have a few plates around. Any other guesses? What else could have been missing? Yes? Ah, napkins. They have to have plates and napkins. That's very good. I like this group. One more guess. Yes? They had plates, napkins, forks, and spoons. Now we have a complete meal except
The person.
Ogalusa had not yet returned. They were looking around, waiting for the hunter. Where is our father? And the villagers wondered, where is the great hunter? His wife knew that sometimes he would stay away a day or 2, but that turned into 3. And then a week went by, and he had not returned. Where is Ogalusa? Something has happened to the great hunter. And everybody began to buzz around the village. Where was their father? Where was the hunter? But then a week turned into 2. And 2 turned into 3. And he had still not returned. People began to mention his name less and less. There became a time in the village of Kundi that no one mentioned his name. As I mentioned, his wife was pregnant with an 8th child. So it came time for the baby to be born. And you know how it is the moment a baby is born. You forget about your worries, your troubles, you forget about everything else in the world but that baby. And it was what do you think it was? Boy, girl?
Boy.
It was another boy. And so rejoicing was set off in the village as everyone is excited about a new baby being born. All the attention went to him and they forgot about their sorrow, their pain. They forgot about Ogalusa. And the boy began to grow and began to pull up and began to look around and be curious and wonder about the world around him. And he began to see fathers putting their children on their shoulders or teaching them how to hunt or teaching them how to fish. And the boy was curious. And so when he was old enough to make sounds and to form his very first words, the very first thing he said, "Where is my father?" And at that moment, the other 7 sons decided they must find out what happened to Ogalusa, good or bad. But they didn't even know which direction he went or where to look. And then one of the boys said, "We must go that way." "Well, why must we go that way?" said the others. "And what will we find if we do?" "I don't know. Maybe it is my gift. But somehow I know if we go that way, we will find him." And so with nowhere else to turn, they began to follow the boy into the bush. And if one went to the left or right, he said, "No, we must continue this way, and we will find our father." And sure enough, under some bushes, one of them pulled out a piece of a broken bow. It clearly had the markings of Ogalusa. A little bit farther, they pulled out this old piece of cloth. It looked like it was almost dissolving in their fingertips. But it was clear that it belonged to their father. And there, a little farther down the road, they found what they feared more than anything else: the dry bones of their father. And the boys fell to the ground, and darkness fell on them, and they wept for themselves, for their father. But then one stood, and he said, as if receiving a vision, "I believe that I could put these bones together again." "Why would you put the bones together again? Our father is gone." "I don't know. Maybe it is my gift, but I believe that I could put these bones together." And so, like putting together pieces of a puzzle, the boy began to put every single bone in its proper place. Taking a cue from his brother, the next stood and said, "I believe then that I could put flesh on these bones again." And like a spider weaving its web, flesh and muscle began to appear and bring the bones together. "I believe my gift then is to put blood in his body." And this one grabbed the cold ankles of Ogalusa, and blood began to rush in his body. "I believe my gift then is the gift of breath." And his chest rose and fell. "I believe my gift is a gift of movement," said this brother. And he began to dance up, around, and over the body. He touched the stretched, lifeless fingers of Ogalusa, and he twitched, and he moved, and he stood, and looked had his children. And the last one said, I believe my gift is the gift of words. And he touched the mouth of his father, and he looked at his 7 sons, and he said, it is time to go home. And the boys, they danced, they sang, they cried like a parade all the way back to the village of Kundi. Well, that evening, there was a great celebration. Everyone was so excited to see him. But he went in his house, and he stayed there for 7 days. That is the custom of one who's been to the land of the dead and somehow has returned to the land of the living. And when 7 days were complete, he came out, his head was completely shaved. Another sign to show he had been to another world and returned again to this one. And that evening, there was food and music and singing and dancing. And one custom they had was after the food was complete, they would take the cow that they had cooked and they would cut off his tail. And they would make what is called a cowtail switch. They would weave in pieces of leather and cowrie shells and beads, and it was kind of like a scepter, a symbol of honor. And the elder gave it to Ogalusa. And he silenced the crowd. And he began to tell them stories of where he had been and how he had returned. And then he held up the cowtail switch. I will give this cowtail switch to the one of my children, the one who is most responsible for bringing me back to the land of the living. Well, it was me. I pointed the way, said the first brother. Yeah, but I put the bones together. I put flesh on it, and they began to fight and argue who was most important, who was most significant, what is the essence of life. And the villagers began to argue too, but what is the body without blood or bones or flesh? But then the last son spoke up. But what about words? How could we tell stories of the land beyond, or the cowtail switch? How could we know what our Father is even saying or thinking or doing without the power of our words? How could we pass them on from generation to generation? And Ogalusa silenced the crowd one more time, and he held up the switch. I will give this cowtail switch to my youngest son. For had he not said, where is my father? I would still be lying cold in the land of the dead. And so this story accentuates a proverb that says a man or woman is never truly dead unless they are forgotten. My story about how I got involved in storytelling is twofold. The more literal kind of how I got involved professionally in storytelling was years ago. I used to work in a day camp, kind of after school recreation setting, and I was over a center, and we would always tell the kids stories, as you do, read them books. And so I had read so many books, and oftentimes young children want you to read the same stories to them. And so there was a time that I remember this particular day that I'm like, you know what? I know this story. I tossed the book over my shoulder and I just started telling them the story. And then I noticed something almost magical happen. It was like they were looking at me, I was looking at them, they were smiling. It was like, this is amazing. It was a totally different dynamic than just reading a story. And so from that time, I began to work on stories and just telling them things and involving them. And then as time went on, I started including other aspects of it. I have a background in theater. I'd done some mime. Later on, I learned some music and added that to it. And then I realized that there was this whole storytelling world, that there was national festivals and local festivals and small storytelling swap groups. And I didn't know that. I thought I was the only one. And it was just amazing about how that evolved. So the first time I got involved is professionally was after I'd been doing it for my center. Then a few other centers say, hey, could you come and tell us the story to my kids? This is all within the same organization. I got a phone call from someone who had got a grant to hire a storyteller to tell stories about diversity. And actually my brother, I didn't get it, my brother worked for this organization, and he told them about me. And so that's how they called me. And they hired me. I tried out, told them a story, and that was probably almost 20 years ago. It was an agency called Fair Housing of Marin, and they're still there, and I still have a relationship with them. I still do stories from time to time for them. But that was kind of how I got involved professionally. Now, the real story of how I became a storyteller was when I was in the 4th grade. Miss Majors, my teacher, assigned us a project to create a game. And it was one of those, in the 4th grade, you do like the more long-term papers, like, not the little sentences or paragraphs. So this was gonna be like a project. We had to write a narrative about the story. We had to create it, whether it was an outdoor game, indoor game, actually literally create it, gather supplies, put it together, bring it to class, and actually do a demonstration of the story. So it was like really pretty involved, maybe 5, 6 steps. And then to make it even more exciting, she was gonna have the kids vote on the best one. 4th graders, competitive. 4th grader, procrastinator. Didn't do it, didn't even every time she brought up in class, oh, you guys should be at this step, you should be doing this by now. Just put it off. I figured it would go away. You know how sometimes kids figure if they don't think about it, don't speak it into existence, it does not exist. Well, it did exist, and the day it was due, 2 weeks later, I see parents coming with boxes and cones and painted objects. I was like, whoa. That's when I realized I was in trouble and I should have done this project. So the only advantage I had going for me is my name is Kirk Waller. W's, end of the alphabet. So she went through everybody, then she said, okay, Kirk, what do you got? So I left it at home. That was my best opening line. And she, being a great 4th grade teacher, said, oh, that's fine. You can bring it tomorrow. Just stand up and tell us about your project today. Give us an idea. Well, it was a board game about galactic empires conquer the earth. And there, at that moment, I became a storyteller. And I started making up this idea about, I was covered in foil, and I got the little game Parcheesi pieces and covered them in foil, and I took paper towel rolls, toilet paper rolls, and covered them in foil, and I made a spinner out of a paper clip, and I explained it, and I got so involved in this explanation that when it was finished, the kids clapped, and they voted. I'm not kidding, I won first prize. Now, I have to tell you, the addendum, this is like the cautionary tale. I did not get a grade on that. She did catch me out, and she did the next day she pulled me to the side. But she was such a wonderful teacher. A couple months later, she invited me and a few children to audition for a play. The Wizard of Oz, up at Cal State University, Hayward at the time. It's East Bay now. And I got in the part. So she, instead of scolding me, which she had every right to do, she channeled that creativity into something positive. And I actually really credit her for getting me involved in theater and performance and storytelling from that unfortunate incident.
What do you think storytelling does for people, the listeners and the storytellers?
That's a good question. I think the big thing that I think storytelling is safe. It's a safe way to explore your emotions, in a sense. I think that's one thing that really, for me, that I found, that there are principles, there's archetypes, there's these things that have gone back hundreds, sometimes thousands of years in stories. That's why they remain. That's why they survive. And they're things that we all relate to, fear and death and life, and belonging and love. There was one storyteller who said that, see if I can remember what she said. She said she believes stories are about 2 things: love, and I think the other one was belonging, but I know love was one. But she said they really boil down to, basically what her point was, they boil down to the essence of the things that are important in us, to us. Love, fear, those things that we all feel. And I think stories and storytelling offers an avenue to explore that safely. One of the stories that I do, that you heard me do today, the Cowtail Switch, for me is a perfect example, because it's a folktale. It's interesting, it's different, it's kind of exotic, it's unique, it has some fun parts in it, but it's really a story about a hunter who dies, and the people forgot about him after a while. And then in the story, he's brought back to life by some amazing magic, but the point is that we can't forget them. The magic is telling stories and keeping them alive through that way. And that story is a great example for me of exploring when my wife died. I actually told that story before I was able to tell her story. Because while I'm telling it, I'm feeling it. While I'm telling it, I'm driven to keep, stories alive and to keep the ancestors alive and to keep her alive. And then I was able to build a bridge to actually create and develop a story about her. And so it was a safe way to explore that. And so for me, even fun, silly folk tales have some really serious things. Brer Rabbit stories, which to me are the most fun, whimsical stories, they explore some of the most common elements in our life, survival. That's really what Brer Rabbit stories are about to me, is he figures out a way to survive. Not right, not wrong, just to make it. And so for me, stories are really a great way to just explore those common things that we all have.
What advice would you give to new storytellers?
I think one of the biggest things that I could tell if anyone just wants to start telling, or they're new, or they're just young and getting going, is to sound super deep. It's really complicated. Is to tell stories and keep telling them. And don't wait forever to tell them in front of someone else. Work on them, get a good sense of them, and start telling. I remember meeting someone at the end of a festival and asked me, how do you know all those stories? I said, well, just practice them. She said, well, I practice stories, but I got to tell them at least 100 times before I feel good enough to perform them. And she meant that literally 100 times. And I said, don't do that. I never tell people what they should and shouldn't do. I told her, don't do that. Because you want to get the story out. And I think that's the more you get it out, and you get it out into the air and open, you'll hear it and feel it, and the audience will respond or not respond. And I think that's the best way to kind of fine-tune a story and help work on it. So just tell it. One thing that I think is just beautiful and amazing, that like the instruments that I brought today, particularly the ngoni and the balafon, they go back to the 13th and 12th century. And that to think that's where actually griots, the word griot, that's where the first griots were kind of associated with in that same time period, the 12th century Mali type, about somewhere around there. And the fact that they have kept their culture alive and through storytelling, oral tradition, is amazing to think that it goes back that many hundreds of years, and I'm still telling those stories today. There's a story, a musical that's around Shen Yen, that you see in a lot of billboards around now. It's a Chinese folk tale that is like, I don't know if it's 1,000 years old, but it's like hundreds of years old. And that history, that power, I think goes back to that other question too about what's important about storytelling, is because those things I think are so universal, that it allows these African stories and Asian stories and European stories to survive through time. And one thing I think is important, it's interesting when I'll go to festivals, or especially schools, is people feel, well, storytelling it's a lost art, which I don't really feel I don't agree it's a lost art, because we tell stories every single day. But as an art form, what they're saying is, things are getting so fast-paced and so digital, and so physical, I think, with it, everything has to be, in your hands and available at the press of a button, is that storytelling still keeps that raw human power, and is able to capture that and pass that along. And I don't know if money or anything can put a value on that. I didn't tell a story today, but there's a few stories that are kind of considered slave tales. And even the Brer Rabbit is kind of in that tradition, but they're stories that on the surface they just seem almost whimsical and fun, and people still like them today for that reason. But below the surface, there's so much strength and hope and resilience in them, especially like the Brer Rabbit type of stories. There's a story by Virginia Hamilton, not by her, but she has captured it and retold it. It's called Big Wolf and Little Daughter, and there's another version of it that I think you'll find in the library, Virginia Hamilton. But anyway, it's a story about a little girl, little black girl, who lives out in the woods with her papa, and he tells her don't go outside the gate because there's wolves outside the gate. So eventually he goes away, she goes outside the gate, a wolf comes, and she sings this song to kind of mesmerize the wolf and eventually make her way back home. That's like the 30-second version. But that story, even though it's really interesting and fun and musical, it's really about using your wits to overpower someone who's stronger than you, who may be the oppressor. And so there's all these layers of meanings, which I think, not only in the folk stories, but a lot of the songs as well, that carry those messages that help give strength and hope and resilience, which I think, is awesome. Some of my favorites, okay, there's like 3 and it's interesting enough, they're national tellers, international tellers, but all 3 of them are from California. One is Willie Claflin, which you haven't read. I'm sure you must have read him at some time. But Willie Claflin is just a great influence. He tells personal stories, folk stories. He plays instruments. He's incredibly funny, but he's also incredibly moving as well. And he has a great knowledge of folklore. Diane Ferlat has been probably the most singular influence on my storytelling. I mean, she's from Southern California, but she's been telling stories probably on a professional level for 40 years or so, and she is still going strong, and she is amazing. And then the last one is Bill Harley. He is probably, I think he's the only storyteller who has won a Grammy for spoken word. And I don't even think they do that category anymore, so he will hold that mantle forever. And his claim to fame, I think, was like he did a lot of children's music and children's songs and stuff around, but he tells to adults, he plays. He was actually one of the ones who influenced me. He was one of the first storytellers I saw that played music and told stories, which I thought was, because for years I just seen storytellers, which were great, but then he brought that level of music, which takes it to a whole nother, side of your brain and a whole nother kind of texture. And so he was a big influence in that, and they're all people that I know and that are accessible. They're like just, generous with their knowledge and their time, but they're amazing storytellers as well. I have a question that I like to answer. I don't know if I know the answer to it, but it's something I thought of, is like, where is storytelling going?
What was my next question?
I think it's interesting. I don't know, I'm not like a historian of storytelling, but I know, some 30, 40 years ago or so, there was this storytelling renaissance in the United States, and that's when the festivals became really big. That's when the national festival just kind of took off. And I think that part may not be as strong, but it has kind of evolved into this, like the Moth and the Front Porch, the type of more personal storytelling, and that appeals more towards a younger group, maybe young adult type of age as well. And so I, in my opinion, I really believe that it's going to kind of blend the two together, because there's a few festivals that actually do that. They'll include some of the traditional stories as well as invite the younger, Moth type of, storytellers. The festival that we met at, actually, it was a guy from that told stories at the Moth, and he's a Grand Slam winner. And then you have, Gay Ducey, has been around forever telling traditional stories and personal stories. And so I think that it's going to be a blending, because I think you cannot get rid of the traditional tales for the reasons we talked about. Those are the things that keep going strong. Personal stories, I think, are what grab us and connect us. I think the traditional stories are what keep stories alive. And I think you have to have both of them, because even the younger group the younger generations that may not on one level feel as interested in the traditional older stories, they're about the same stuff. They're about the exact same stuff, they're just told in a different context, right? They're about love, they're about hate, they're about fear, they're about, oppression, they're about all these themes. So I really hope, at least, but I believe that that's where the future is going. I don't mean that the stories will be blended, but that you'll have both that are accepted. It won't feel like it's two camps, like it sort of kind of does now, but it'll be more of a blending and hopefully an embracing of storytelling, period. Because I can't imagine it going anywhere, even as our digital age gets more and more advanced. I think stories will be there because they're in our DNA. We can't survive without telling our story. I remember the first time I went to the National Storytelling Festival. I don't know if it was the first time, but it was one of the times I went. And Captain Wyndham, which is like, the storyteller, I was amazed because there's this little old white lady from Alabama, just super unassuming, tiny frame. I'm like, and I'm like, I'm energetic, I'm more theatrical, I play music, and that's the kind of stories I like. And I'm like, what's the big deal? What's she gonna do, right? And she gets up there, she stands behind the mic in the most unassuming, no frills, just starts telling the story in her sweet Southern accent about back home in Alabama, and you could literally hear a pin drop. 1,500 people were in this particular venue. I stopped and I heard a cricket chirping outside the tent, and I am not being symbolic. You literally heard the cricket chirping. It was that quiet. And so, but it's like you said, is once she, excuse me, sorry, I'm gonna sit back down. But when she started telling her stories, have a way of taking walls down, because you're hearing their heart, you're hearing their stories about home, about growing up, about their own struggles and survivals and triumphs and failures, and I think that's a beautiful thing. That's why even companies have went the way of more storytelling than fact-based training and presentation. I mean, people want to hear their story. They don't want to hear a bullet point fact. And I think it's that same element. Stories have a way of taking the walls down. They have a way of making, in their eyes, the customers relate, as opposed to, just think they're going to buy some shiny object. But when I hear your story, I'm more open to you. One thing I love is, like, I don't know if you overheard the lady that came up at the end, but she got teary-eyed, just saying, I just love your stories. And I just felt when you were telling stories, there's like this light around you, and I don't think you were up there alone. And in other words, she connected, she related, they're universal. I told a story about my late wife. I told it at a theater in LA, and at the time, this is years ago, and I was a good 6, 7, 8 years younger than I am now. And this old lady, maybe 70s, maybe 80s, came up to me. And my story was called My Angel. This is kind of it was a story about her being kind of like my angel. But this lady came up to me and said, my husband died just a year or so ago, and that's what he called me, his angel. And with tears in her eyes, we just hugged, because two totally different generations, different races, from different parts of the country, related. We connected through the story. Mine was my angel, hers was an angel, somebody else's was some other word for it, but we all have that loss or that thing or that person, that we can connect through, and that's, can't say enough about that.
Yeah, I was getting goosebumps on the first story about the finding the bones.
Yeah. Yes, and why? So that's the question. It's different for you than it will be for somebody else, and to me that's why how stories rise to the same level as what we consider other great forms of art, is because you connect in one way, somebody else connects in another way. If I asked what's this story about, you get a couple of different answers, which I think is the beauty of it, and that's the way it should be. Not that no, it's about this. No, it's about that to you, and I'm glad that you connected, but to them, they got this totally different thing out of it, and that's okay too. Well, I better stop or I'll talk all day.